In touring cars, the BTCC, there's been some big dramatic news, Dan, that Dan Lloyd and MG have parted ways. What's going on?
Yeah, it was a big story that only came out about a couple of hours ago. What happened was I saw the statement released on Facebook, and as you say, Daniel Lloyd and MG have parted company due to a further statement issued by Daniel Lloyd. He suggested some of his sponsors had pulled out because of the lack of success with the MG for this season, which has meant that they've not been able to run up the front. They've been really competitive. The MG has been very competitive throughout the years. But the rocky start we've seen to this season, which let's not forget, it's all intermingled, the AAA racing squad alongside BMR. So that's a whole different conversation. But the lack of success that they've been having has meant several of Dan's sponsors have pulled out, which has now meant that once again he's without a ride. And it's a massive shame because Daniel Lloyd, we all say it in the paddock, he is a massive talent, and it is a shame that he's going to be on the sidelines. But these things happen at the end of the day. Sponsors pulling out, not enough exposure. I don't want to suggest it, but you got to suggest it. It's a age-old case in motor racing, isn't it?
Unfortunately, I mean, I did try and reach out to Dan before we came on air, and obviously he's not willing to talk about the news, and understandably, because he doesn't want to talk about it. It's not good news. Why would you? He has released a statement, and he put a link to the statement and emailed all the people that are on his email list, really. The statement says, amongst other things, that this was a big investment year for me and my backers. I was so excited to have joined MG for 2017. Unfortunately, as you said, Dan, the results have led to us already losing a number of sponsors for this season, and has forced us to make a very difficult decision to walk away from BTCC for the time being. Interesting.
Can I just say... it turns out Daniel Lloyd's actually put something on Facebook as well, just to clear something up, as I've seen a lot of comments blaming the decision on financial issues, which isn't right. I wanted to make the point in the press release that I'm bringing funds to the team, as 95% of the drivers do in BTCC. However, this doesn't work when you don't have the results to shout about and capitalise on. The story might be a little confusing, but I just wanted to clear that up.
It is confusing because he contradicts himself, apparently, according to what you just said, Dan, because sponsors pulling out would suggest that the money's disappeared as well. And for him to say that, I can understand him going on the defensive, because people like to... fans are very passionate, especially touring car fans as well. Ryan, what do you make of tonight's shock news that Daniel Lloyd, for the time being, he says, is no longer a touring car driver?
Yeah, come a bit out of the blue, that did, didn't it? The MGs, they've had a difficult start this season. They've been struggling to get into the top 10, or struggling, to even get out of the top 20 some races. I think particularly they struggled at. MG's always been an inconsistent car. Sometimes it's fast at some tracks, but other tracks it's way behind. Dan Lloyd's a super talented driver. It's going to be a shame to lose him from the British touring car grid. I remember when he was driving for the Eurotech Civic, and he was way up the front end of grid in qualifying a couple of races. When you're fighting for results down the back end of the grid, again, there's much exposure on the television, because obviously touring cars are televised, and the sponsor obviously chosen to pull out for those reasons, it's a shame, because like I said earlier, Dan's a super talented driver, so it's a big loss to the BTCC.
It is. Sorry, Lester, just to interject, that I don't suppose he would have helped his big crash back at Thruxton a couple of weeks ago, which more or less wrote the car off. I think that's a substantial amount of damage. If that didn't happen, we might not be having this conversation right now.
You think so?
Well, you've got to think it to an extent, haven't you? Because we see a lot in motor racing that drivers will pull out because of unexpected crashes. I know in the touring cars especially, you've got to budget for replacement doors, replacement anything basically. But a crash of that velocity that might not have helped the budget. I'm not suggesting that's the core reason. As you say, sponsors pulling out are still sponsors pulling out, or allegedly sponsors pulling out. But at the end of the day, as you say, it's a shame to lose him off the grid, but circumstances have never been on Dan's side. But we've seen when he, as you say, the Eurotech Honda, he was on it. But we've seen with BMR this year that they've just seemed to have struggled all over the board this year.
It has been a bit of a shame. If it was all about results, then yeah, it's a shame either way, results or sponsors pulling out. But I thought that's kind of what contracts were for, to be honest, to basically seal in sponsors for a certain period of time and not have them flee at the first sign of a crash, for example, like the big crash that Dan had. Ryan, do you think that's the case, perhaps?
Well, it probably does have some kind of a knock-on effect. I don't think it's exactly just that cause alone, but it probably did have some kind of effect on the decisions as well. But yeah, I don't think the accident alone is the full reason for it. I just think that British touring cars is becoming expensive to run cars in British touring cars now. To be competitive, you have to have a lot of money, and if sponsors sign up to a team, they want to get as much exposure as possible for their business, and if those results are not coming and the exposure is not coming through lack of results, then sponsors are going to pull out. And like I said, it's expensive. You need those sponsors to go racing.
Dan, and I mentioned this only very sort of briefly the other week, but could the huge grids in touring cars actually be a bad thing? Because you're watching on ITV4 live and free, of course, every round, and there's so much stuff that happens in a touring car race. You only get to see one little part of that, and that could be a fight for the lead, a fight for an interesting fight for 10th place, for example, or it could be basically you're only able to watch one thing at a time. So do you think it could be the case that too much of a grid right now in 2017 is putting sponsors off because they're not getting value for money, i.e. airtime, and their sponsors' logos on TV?
I don't believe that, no, because it can't just be the fact that I know TV is always going to be a massive factor, but you've still got to take into account the hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people who go trackside every year to go and watch this racing. It's an interesting one, as you say. Personally, I think the grids are too large at the moment anyway, regardless of funding, regardless of this, that and the other. But it won't be helping the results, as you say. But we look at certain teams, certain cars, you'll see there's a lot of them. And as you say, but it can't just be about the big manufacturers, because some of the manufacturers have struggled profusely this year. We look at the likes of Josh Cook & Co., who are really up there fighting for it, going really well in a independent car. So the cars, I do agree to an extent with what Ryan said, because the cars aren't cheap to run, but they're not as expensive as S2000. They weren't anywhere near as expensive as Super Touring. It's not cheap, but it's not expensive. That's why we've got 32 cars out on there, because people have got money to race these cars. The exposure is an interesting one, and in an ideal world would say, well, that could be the reason, but there's got to be more to it than that. I don't fully believe that the only issue is going to be down to funding, and I'm not trying to suggest that could be. It could be a big conspiracy theory. I'm not trying to suggest that, but personally, I don't believe that purely 32 cars on the grid is withdrawing money from sponsors, because we're seeing team sponsors paying more and more for more and more cars. So, fair play. It's down to personal preference, but it's an interesting one. We're going to have to get to the bottom of this story. And of course, this weekend, British touring cars at Croft. So, we're going to have to go and deputise someone to go and find out for us, I think.
Yeah, that will, I suppose, if there is an alternative conspiracy theory, as Dan kind of touched on, if that is the case at all, then it will all come out in due course, perhaps over this weekend. Dan did be, that's the nice bit of English, Dan Lloyd was recently racing in China with some GT stuff.
Shall I look for you?
Yes. It seemed a strange decision at the time. Not necessarily a bad decision, but just out of nowhere, out of the blue. And I've completely forgot what the championship. It wasn't like Asian Blancpain or Blancpain Asia, was it? Might have been, could be. I don't know.
I'm looking now,
but it was for Ford, and I think it was announced like a couple of days before the race actually happened, and he flew out and he announced it by way of like him standing in a suit, looking all happy and smiling.
Yes.
And he thanked
Chinese touring cars.
That's the one. Chinese touring cars. And it seemed like a bit of a strange decision to have MG let him do that. So I don't know. Perhaps that combined with maybe the big crash as well, combined with sponsors just getting a bit of cold feet, perhaps. I don't know. Maybe the whole thing, just little things like that, just added up to mean that he can no longer compete for now in the BTCC. But maybe we'll see him back. Maybe he'll be back in a Porsche somewhere, or maybe even in British GT.
I wouldn't put it past him if he was, but I'll tell you what. You say about your Chinese touring car thing, that's an interesting one to go into, because of course Anna Morgan's raced out there before. We've seen several people going out there and racing before in the Chinese touring cars. It's a very competitive series, but Adam raced last year in a VW.
Are you reading this off Wikipedia?
No, I'm reading this off another touring car related website, but okay. See, I get my news, alternate news from somewhere. But anyway, the point I'm making is it is an interesting one because it's MG's prime territory. I don't think it's going to be a big consideration considering how much Dan said he loved representing the brand, doing all the Q&A stuff for the brand at the circuits and out of circuits. But it's an interesting one. But again, we need to go away and analyse it. But it's a shame, as you say, Daniel Lloyd's not there. But I do think there could be a late gasp run in the British GT. I mean, there's a couple of seats potentially running around for this weekend's meeting. We've seen 2 announcements already today, which we'll get onto later, but who knows?